I stood at the edge of the lawn, my suitcase digging into my palm, watching Alan toss my photo albums onto the curb like expired junk mail. The porch light I changed every winter flickered above Victoria's shoulder as she said it. "It's not your house anymore." My name wasn't on the mailbox. My bed wasn't inside. After raising her alone, after signing over every safety net I had, after giving her the roof she now stood under, I was just a burden, a guest, a problem to be moved. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The afternoon sun bore down on the cracked sidewalk as Margaret Collins pulled into the driveway of the house she'd called home for nearly 3 decades. Her old Corolla groaned to a stop, its engine ticking softly as it cooled. The front lawn, once trimmed every Saturday with care, had gone wild, patches of yellowed grass clawing up toward the sky like neglected intentions. She frowned. Something was off. The porch light was on, though it was still broad daylight. The mailbox leaned open, stuffed and ignored. Then she saw them. Victoria, standing at the front door in a cream blazer and oversized sunglasses, and Alan, sprawled against the rail, tapping something into his phone with smug disinterest. Margaret stepped out, still in her grocery store apron, her hands gripping a brown paper bag of canned soup and oatmeal. "Tori?" Victoria turned slowly. Her face was hard, cool, composed, like someone posing for a magazine spread. "We need to talk." Margaret's stomach coiled. "Is everything all right?" Alan pushed off the railing and took the bag from her arms without asking. He turned and began walking toward the curb. "I'll get the rest," he called over his shoulder. Margaret blinked. "The rest of what?" Victoria exhaled like it exhausted her to explain. "You can't stay here anymore, Mom. It's not your house." The words didn't land immediately. They floated, absurd and out of place. "What are you talking about?" Margaret laughed nervously. "Of course it's my house. I raised you here." "You transferred the deed to me. In trust," Victoria said sharply. 3 years ago. You said you wanted to make sure things were secure if something ever happened to you." I I did that to protect you," Margaret said, her voice cracking. "After the hospital bills, after your car accident, I was just trying to. And now I'm protecting my assets," Victoria snapped, crossing her arms. "It's time you moved on." Margaret took a shaky step back. "Moved on to what?" Victoria, I don't have anywhere to go." Alan reappeared with 2 cardboard boxes stacked in his arms, one of them tipping dangerously with the weight of old photo albums. "You've got friends, don't you? That Susan lady still around?" he said casually, dropping the boxes near the curb like trash day had come early. Victoria didn't look at her mother. "I'll have the locks changed tonight. Please don't make this more difficult than it has to be." Margaret stood frozen on the front step, the wind catching the hem of her apron as if trying to pull her away. Her eyes stung. "This is my home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Victoria finally looked at her, really looked, and for a flash of a second, something flickered behind her cool exterior. But it was gone before Margaret could place it. "Not anymore." Alan held out a suitcase, its handle fraying. "We packed the essentials." Margaret stared at it. The handle was stained with years of travel, hospital visits, college move-ins, weekend getaways. It had carried everything from baby clothes to legal papers. Now it held the sum of her life as someone else decided it was disposable. "I was your mother," she said quietly, voice shaking as she took the suitcase. "I still am." Victoria stepped back inside without answering. Alan stayed long enough to grin. "Guess the old saying's true," he said. "No good deed goes unpunished." The door shut with a clean, mechanical click. Margaret stood there on the front lawn for a moment watching the house, the windows she'd washed every spring, the gutter she'd cleaned alone when Victoria's dad passed, The tree she'd planted when Victoria turned 10. All of it behind glass now. Cold. Untouchable. A neighbor's car passed slowly, the driver glancing curiously at the boxes on the curb. Margaret turned her face away, clutching the suitcase to her chest like armor. She walked down the sidewalk, her shoes scraping the concrete, breath shallow and uneven. She didn't know where she was going, just that she couldn't stop. Behind her, the porch light flickered, then died. The living room was dim, lit only by the soft, flickering glow of a table lamp with a crooked shade. Susan's floral couch, once firm and proud in its department store days, had sunk into itself over the years, much like the women it now held. Margaret sat stiffly at one end, wrapped in an old quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and lemon polish. Her shoes were still on. Rain tapped against the windows, light at first, like hesitant fingers knocking on glass. Outside, the last threads of dusk unraveled, the sky bruising deep gray over Austin. Susan emerged from the kitchen with a mug of chamomile tea, steam curling from the rim. She handed it over silently, then perched on the ottoman across from her friend. Margaret took the mug, both hands trembling slightly. She hadn't spoken since arriving. The suitcase sat near the door, unopened, leaking the corner of a faded t-shirt onto the hardwood like a wound. "She threw me out," Margaret finally said, voice raw. Susan nodded once, gently. "I saw." She said it's her house. Margaret laughed bitterly, but the sound caught midway. "And she's right. I signed it over. Like an idiot." "No," Susan said firmly. "You did what mothers do. You protected her." "I didn't protect her," Margaret murmured, shaking her head. "I handed her everything. The deed, the savings account, the trust I built after her father died. All of it. No conditions. Just blind faith." Susan reached forward and placed a warm hand over Margaret's. "She didn't take your trust. She took advantage of it. That's different." The lamp buzzed faintly, struggling against the gathering storm. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling leaves like whispered regret. "I worked 2 jobs after Frank died," Margaret said, her gaze distant. "Day shifts at the registrar's office. Nights stocking shelves at the supermarket. Victoria never knew. I used to come home, soak my feet in vinegar water, and iron her school uniforms before bed. She thought the tooth fairy brought her birthday gifts." Susan gave a soft, bitter laugh. "She grew up thinking money came from nowhere." Margaret blinked hard. "Maybe I let her think that too long." A crack of thunder split the silence, long and low, vibrating through the floorboards. Margaret flinched. The storm had arrived without ceremony, wind howling now, rain hammering against the porch. "I kept telling myself she'd grow into the woman I raised," Margaret whispered, staring down at her tea. "But maybe I didn't raise her at all. Maybe I just shielded her." Susan leaned back, folding her arms. "You didn't shield her. You gave her room to stand. She just chose to step on you instead." Margaret's mouth tightened. For the first time since the eviction, she didn't look broken. She looked lit from inside, a pilot flame sparking in the darkness. "I should have seen this coming," she said quietly. "The way she let Alan talk over me. The bank meetings she told me not to worry about. The second appraisal on the house. She was planning this long before today." "You still have the documents?" Susan asked. Margaret nodded. "Tucked between Emily's baby pictures." Susan arched an eyebrow. "Good." The wind screamed outside, loud enough to make the windows groan. Rain beat down like fists. Margaret stood slowly, walking to the window. The street outside shimmered, street lamps glowing in watery halos. She touched the glass with her fingertips, watching the storm churn over the quiet neighborhood. "She took my house," Margaret said softly, "but not everything." She turned, eyes clearer than before, her silhouette drawn in sharp edges against the lightning flash behind her. She forgot who built it, who paid for every shingle, every pipe, every damn window she's now polishing with imported silk rags. Susan rose beside her. Then remind her. Margaret exhaled slowly like she was letting go of something heavy. Then she whispered, not to Susan, but to herself, and to the night. This isn't the end. The following Saturday arrived with skies as blue and merciless as Victoria's ambition. Margaret stood at the edge of her neighborhood's community garden, tying twine around tomato stakes with hands that had not yet stopped shaking, though it had been days. The scent of fresh basil and turned soil filled the air. But it couldn't drown out the laughter echoing from the block just 2 streets over. "Big blowout," murmured Mrs. Halloway, an older neighbor walking past with her bichon frise. "Your daughter sure knows how to throw a party." Margaret didn't look up. "She's not throwing it for me." Later that evening, Susan returned from a grocery run with more than just paper towels and eggs. She tossed her phone onto the coffee table, its screen still lit. "You need to see this." Margaret wiped her hands on her jeans and leaned over. The phone showed a photo. Victoria standing on the sweeping stone steps of a mansion Margaret didn't recognize. Her arms stretched wide in a champagne-colored gown that sparkled like money. Gold spotlights cast halos behind her as if she were being canonized. She captioned it, "Self-made and shining," Susan muttered, disgust curling the edge of her voice. She bought a place out in Westlake, 5 bedrooms, pool, theater room, gated entry. You know, because of all the haters. Margaret barely blinked. "Self-made," she whispered, the word sour in her mouth. Susan tapped again. A new photo filled the screen. Victoria surrounded by clinking glasses, men in silk suits, women in dresses stitched like second skins. On Victoria's neck hung a strand of creamy pearls, their clasp slightly tarnished. Margaret froze. "Those were my grandmother's." Susan tilted the phone, zooming in. "You sure?" "She gave them to me the night Frank proposed," Margaret said. "I kept them in the old jewelry box. Top drawer, left corner." Her voice had gone quiet, not shaken, not hurt, just stripped. Susan lowered the phone. "You want to know what really stings?" she asked. "Half of the women in that photo? Church friends, book club ladies. That's Carol Mathis sitting next to the koi pond with a flute of rosé. Didn't she used to eat your cobbler like it was holy?" Margaret nodded slowly, something inside her tightening. Not a breaking, but a binding. "She told me once," Margaret said, "when she was 13, that the worst thing in the world would be being ordinary. I thought she was just a teenager talking. Turns out, she meant it." The music from the mansion was faintly audible even here, low bass thumping under the night like a heartbeat too fast to trust. Margaret walked to the window and looked out toward the dark trees in the distance, where Victoria's house glittered beyond the hilltops like a lighthouse for lost morals. "She's showing off what she stole," Susan said behind her. Margaret turned back toward the purse on the entryway hook. She unzipped it slowly, her hand disappearing into the lining. From a hidden pocket, she pulled out a small folder of aging documents, creased, watermarked, but intact. The original trust agreement, the property deed. A letter from Frank's life insurance policy, long paid and forgotten, but once the lifeline that kept Victoria's education afloat. "She doesn't know I kept these," Margaret said, her voice flat. Susan raised an eyebrow. "Do they mean anything now?" Margaret tucked the folder back inside. "Maybe, maybe not, but she's not as free as she thinks." A flash lit up the sky. Fireworks now, not lightning. Red, white, and gold bursts above the tree line, choreographed to the beat of a party funded by betrayal. Susan handed over her phone again, swiping to one last photo. Victoria stood on her patio with a mic in hand, laughing into the crowd. "She said this," Susan muttered, reading from the caption. I built this from nothing. No handouts, no favors, just me and grit. Margaret stared at the screen, expression unreadable. Then she turned, walked toward the kitchen drawer, and pulled out a pen. "Let's see what grit looks like when the past comes knocking," she murmured. The downtown office building was the kind that tried too hard to be sleek. Brushed metal handles, black glass windows, and a lobby that smelled like synthetic citrus and anxious ambition. Margaret hadn't been here in nearly 4 years. She remembered the elevator buttons sticking, the cheap carpet along the hallway curling at the edges. None of it had changed. She stepped into the office of Hale and McKinnon like a woman walking into her own past. The receptionist didn't recognize her. That was fine. Margaret didn't come for smiles. "Do you have an appointment?" the woman asked without looking up. "Tell Richard Hale that Margaret Collins is here. He'll see me." The receptionist opened her mouth, clearly ready to push back, but something in Margaret's posture, shoulders square, eyes cold, made her pause. "I'll check." 5 minutes later, the glass door to the back offices clicked open. "Margaret," Richard Hale said, stepping out, his voice dipped in lawyerly charm. His dark hair had grayed at the temples since she last saw him, but the suit was still expensive, and the smile still practiced. "Well, this is unexpected." "Not really," she said. He hesitated, then gestured down the hall. "Come in." His office was too cold, the air conditioning humming louder than the city traffic below. He motioned to the leather chair across from his desk. Margaret sat but didn't settle. "I saw the photos," she said. "The mansion, the cars, the fireworks show. Quite the empire my daughter's building." Richard leaned back, fingers steepled. "Victoria's certainly done well for herself." Margaret stared at him until the silence became unbearable. Then she slid the folder across the desk, her copy of the trust agreement and deed. "I kept the originals." He opened it slowly, scanning. His eyes flicked to hers. "You always were smart. Most people don't think to keep the paper trail once they sign it away." "I want you to tell me where the $33 million came from," he sighed. "You know I can't disclose client information." "You represented both of us," she interrupted. "You drafted these. You watched me sign everything over to her when she was flailing through student debt and failed startups. You said it was smart, that a trust would simplify everything later. You remember that?" Richard didn't flinch. "It was a mutually agreed transfer. You weren't coerced." "No, just misled." He looked down at the documents again, lips pressed into a line. "Victoria didn't tell you she sold part of the land, did she?" Margaret's stomach went still. "What land?" "The backlot, zoned for commercial development. She leveraged your original deed when it was still in trust to partner with a group of investors. That property ballooned when the tech park expansion was approved. Her equity in that deal? $33 million. Minus taxes and management fees." Margaret's throat was dry. She reached into her purse again, pulled out a second page. "This shows the trust was created under my name. She never dissolved it properly. She just assumed." Richard didn't deny it. She sat back, her heart thudding so loud she thought he might hear it. "You may have more leverage than you think," he said finally, almost gently. "But you need to move fast. The contracts she signed? They're messy. That trust still being technically active? That's not a detail the investors would want made public. And you let her do it anyway." His gaze dropped to the desk. Victoria was persuasive and ambitious. She didn't want you in the room when the lawyers started talking numbers. Said it would confuse you. Said you wouldn't understand. "I raised her on minimum wage and tax returns," Margaret said coldly. "I understand plenty." Richard looked genuinely sorry, for himself, not for her. "If this goes to court, it's not just your daughter's name on the filings. It'll be mine too." Margaret stood. Then maybe next time you'll think twice about selling out the people who trusted you. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, but she was already walking. The Travis County Clerk's office didn't exactly scream drama, but Margaret had learned by now that the most devastating betrayals rarely did. Rows of aging filing cabinets lined the back wall, humming computers filled the central workstations, and the overhead lights flickered just enough to unsettle the nerves. The woman behind the records counter glanced up as Margaret approached with a polite but bored expression. "Property records?" the clerk asked. "Yes, historical and recent," Margaret replied, sliding over a notepad with several parcel numbers already scribbled down. "These lots, all connected to the North Lamar Trust, filed under Collins, Margaret, and Victoria." The clerk raised a brow at the specificity but said nothing. Within minutes, a stack of folders thudded onto the desk. The top one stamped "Zoning Reclassified. Expedited Approval." Margaret carried them to an empty desk by the window, rolling up her sleeves like she used to before a deep cleaning day at home. The outside world blurred through rain-streaked glass, but she didn't notice. She flipped pages, cross-checked dates, sales agreements, transfer forms, tax reports, contracts naming shell LLCs with fancy names, Ridgeway Development, Iron Point Holdings, but all of them tied in the fine print to a familiar signature, Victoria M. Collins. By noon, she had a dozen discrepancies underlined in red. By 2 o'clock, she had an entire folder of duplicate filings with conflicting figures. At 3:17 p.m., she closed the last file, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled for the first time in hours. That evening, Susan's dining room looked more like a detective's war room than a kitchen. Folders spread like a paper explosion across the oak table. Margaret sat at the center, glasses slipping down her nose, pen in hand, flipping between documents with laser focus. Susan moved from the coffee pot to the table like a nurse on night shift, keeping her friend fueled. "You find something new?" Susan asked, handing over a fresh cup. "Two somethings." Margaret tapped the paperwork. Victoria listed different sale prices on the public filing and the investor disclosure. That's tax fraud. Susan whistled low. "I always knew she was arrogant. I didn't know she was sloppy." Margaret smirked, just slightly. They go hand in hand. A knock at the door pulled Susan away. Moments later, she returned with a visitor in tow, an older man in a tan blazer with coffee stains on the cuff and a vaguely amused expression. "This is Kevin," Susan said. "He's a banker. We went to high school together. Don't ask me how that happened." Kevin chuckled, shook Margaret's hand, then gestured at the piles of paperwork. "Looks like someone's building a case." Margaret nodded. "I'm trying." "Well," he said, flipping through a couple of pages, "I can tell you right now, Allen West has loans under at least 3 different businesses, all maxed. One's about to default. If he's still living high, it's on borrowed time." Margaret's expression didn't change, but her grip on the pen tightened. Kevin continued, lowering his voice. "He also listed Victoria as a co-signer on one of them. That might have been before the buyout, but if those loans weren't cleared, and he dipped into her accounts..." "She's liable," Margaret finished. Her voice was cool, focused. "Even if she doesn't know it." Kevin nodded. "Exactly." He left shortly after, tipping his head with a small, respectful smile. Margaret remained still for a moment before reaching for her notebook and writing a single line in black ink. "They built this on sand." Susan leaned over her shoulder. "So what's next?" Margaret didn't answer at first. She sat quietly, staring down at the line she'd just written, then drew a box around it. A thick, deliberate box. "Now we shake the foundation," she said finally. And for the first time since she'd been shoved off her own porch. Margaret smiled, Not out of relief, not even revenge. Purpose. The sidewalks in Westlake were smoother than memory. No cracks, no weeds, no chalk drawings from children with wild dreams. Just silence and the faint hum of wealth flexing through manicured lawns and imported stone. Margaret walked slowly beneath the sodium street lamps, her breath visible in the cooling October air. She wore her oldest sneakers, soles nearly gone, and a hoodie that once belonged to Frank. Her steps were steady, unhurried. She didn't need to get closer. Victoria's mansion loomed like a theater set, grand, exaggerated, a performance for anyone willing to watch. Modern, cold, and blindingly lit from within, the house pulsed with music and laughter muffled by triple-pane glass. Margaret stopped just beyond the hedgerow, partially obscured by a magnolia tree planted to impress. Inside, through a wide bay window, she saw her daughter surrounded by people who smiled too hard and drank too fast. Victoria held a wine glass like a prop, head thrown back in artificial laughter. Her dress glittered like liquid gold under a dozen recessed lights. Alan stood to her right, animated and loud, his arms swinging as he told a story Margaret couldn't hear, but knew the shape of. The exaggeration, the self-importance, the punchline that made only him laugh. He flashed his wrist, showing off a watch with a face the size of a teacup. Two men leaned in, nodding with the mechanical enthusiasm of men who envied but didn't admire. And just behind them, half hidden by the angle of the room, was Sophie. Margaret hadn't seen her in over a year, but she remembered the girl's soft eyes and stiff posture. Sophie moved quietly now, scooping empty glasses from side tables, folding a throw blanket that had been tossed aside like an afterthought. No one thanked her. No one even looked her way. Margaret's gaze lingered on the maid's hands, small, red from chemical cleaners, placing coasters beneath drinks that had already left rings on the marble. It was a house filled with people, but Margaret had never seen anything so empty. She took a step closer, her feet crunching lightly on the gravel path bordering the lawn. Victoria turned briefly toward the window, maybe sensing the motion, maybe checking her reflection. Their eyes didn't meet. Victoria didn't notice her, or didn't want to. Did she recognize the hollow beneath all the gloss? The isolation of being adored but never trusted? Of building something that glittered so loud it drowned out the silence? Margaret doubted it. She crossed her arms, suddenly aware of how still she felt. Not cold, not angry, just awake. This wasn't power. It was panic with a dress code. Alan had his arm draped lazily around Victoria's waist now, whispering something in her ear. She laughed again, sharp and slightly offbeat, as if reminding herself to perform. Margaret turned away. The house didn't deserve her gaze anymore. As she walked down the hill toward the edge of the neighborhood, the sound of the party faded into background static. She passed a Bentley parked across the driveway, the vanity plate reading "Ellen Wins." She let out a quiet exhale, almost a laugh. Let them have their charade. She pulled her phone from her pocket and opened the Notes app. At the top was her line from earlier that week. They built this on sand. She added beneath it, and the tide's already rising. The Travis County Courthouse looked different in the daylight. Sunlight poured through its arched windows, catching on the dust motes that floated like secret confetti in the marble hall. Margaret had passed through this building once before. Jury duty, years ago, when she still wore her wedding ring. She remembered being nervous then. Today, she wasn't nervous. She was deliberate. She stood at the clerk's window, a manila envelope tucked beneath her arm, the same envelope she'd been piecing together for weeks. The clerk, a young woman with tidy braids and a tone of practiced neutrality, slid a stack of forms toward her. "Petition for declaratory relief?" the clerk asked. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice steady. Attached are supporting exhibits. The clerk glanced over the packet. Tax records, the original trust agreement, a chain of emails between developers and Victoria's LLCs, line after line of proof, tying Victoria's windfall back to the property Margaret had built, maintained, and then, foolishly, signed away. "Everything you need should be in there," Margaret said, pushing the envelope forward. The clerk looked up. "This is thorough. We'll file it today." Margaret nodded. "Good." Later, in Susan's kitchen, the smell of brewed coffee mingled with printer ink. Susan had cleared a spot on the table, moving aside the stacks of documents to plunk down 2 mugs. She was practically vibrating with excitement. "You actually filed?" she asked. Margaret lifted her mug. "This morning." Susan grinned, leaning back in her chair. "Well, hallelujah. Now it's their turn to sweat." Margaret's lips curved, something between a smile and a grimace. Sweat doesn't ruin marble floors, but fear does. She pulled a yellow legal pad from her tote, flipping to the first page. Handwritten notes filled every line, bullet points, quotes, dates, amounts. Her testimony. She read the first line aloud under her breath. "I gave her everything. She gave me nothing." Her pen hovered above the page as she added another note in neat block letters. "Trust betrayed. Both legal and personal." "You're building quite the speech," Susan said, peeking over. "Want me to help?" Margaret shook her head. "It has to be mine. Every word." She set the pen down and pressed her palms flat on the paper. For the first time, the weight of it all felt less like grief and more like ballast. She wasn't being dragged under anymore. She was anchored. She imagined the courtroom, its hushed air, its hard benches. Judge Rayburn presiding, known for his no-nonsense approach. Victoria sitting at her attorney's table, dressed like a queen in exile. Alan probably wouldn't even show. Margaret inhaled. "She thinks money makes her untouchable," she murmured, "but money leaves fingerprints." Susan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "And you've got the prints." They sat in silence for a moment, only the ticking of the kitchen clock filling the room. Margaret returned to her notes, rewriting sentences until they stopped sounding like pain and started sounding like facts. The act of shaping her story into lines, into evidence, steadied her breathing. "Clarity feels strange," she said softly. Susan tilted her head. "How so?" "Like standing on solid ground after weeks of sinking." Susan smiled. "Then keep standing." That afternoon, her phone buzzed with an email notification. "Case scheduled for preliminary hearing. Collins versus Collins." The date was circled in the courthouse's digital stamp, 3 weeks from today. Margaret stared at it, thumb hovering over the screen, before forwarding the email to Susan with a single line. "It's time." Then she opened a fresh page in her notebook. Across the top, she wrote, "Testimony Draft 2.0, and beneath it, the first sentence again, underlined twice. "I gave her everything. She gave me nothing." She paused, pen resting on the paper, then added another line she hadn't planned to write. "But I'm taking myself back." It started quietly. A whisper here, a raised eyebrow there. A book club member opting out of brunch at Victoria's place with a vague excuse about a family thing. A longtime donor pulling out of a charity event she was supposed to host. By the end of the first week after the court filing, the ripple had turned into a slow, deliberate wave. Austen's inner circles may have changed their clothes with the seasons, but they never forgot a good scandal, especially when it came wrapped in couture and betrayal. Margaret never said a word. She didn't need to. The papers were public now. The court date was set. Her name was on the docket, and people who once gossiped about her behind velvet ropes were now leaning in closer to read the fine print. They saw the property titles, the zoning permits, the discrepancy in sale values. They saw what Victoria had built her empire on, and whose shoulders had been crushed beneath it. Susan called it justice by crockpot, slow and scalding. One afternoon, Margaret stood by the fresh produce at H-E-B, selecting peaches, when a woman she hadn't spoken to in years, Lorraine Patton, who once called her the help, behind a too-sweet smile, appeared at her side. "I heard about the lawsuit," Lorraine said, adjusting her pearl earrings. "I just wanted to say, good for you." Margaret didn't blink. "I didn't file it for applause." "I know," Lorraine replied, voice hushed now, "but it's still brave." We all watched what she did. Margaret turned back to the peaches. "Did you?" Meanwhile, behind the gates of Westlake, Victoria's grip on her world was slipping. She noticed first when her stylist canceled a fitting. Then when two potential investors ghosted a meeting Alan had arranged. She spent an entire morning refreshing Instagram, watching her likes plummet by the hour. "They're jealous," Alan said, pacing the living room. "It's noise. Ignore the nobodies." But she couldn't. Not when 3 RSVPs to her upcoming victory brunch dropped out within 10 minutes of each other. Not when someone from her old sorority group unfollowed her with a passive-aggressive quote about real success not coming at someone else's expense. Her hands shook when she picked up her phone and opened the camera. She hit record. The video was nearly 2 minutes long. Victoria, barefaced and faux humble in a cashmere hoodie, sitting cross-legged on her designer couch. "I just need to clear the air," she said, forcing a tight smile. "There's been a lot of misinformation about how I got here, about my journey, and I want to remind everyone that I worked so hard to build what I have. No one gave me anything. Not really. Not where it mattered." She paused dramatically, eyes glistening on cue. "People will always try to tear you down when you're doing better than they ever imagined you could. Especially when you're a woman. Especially when they used to be part of your life, but couldn't keep up." She ended with a clipped nod. "I won't apologize for my ambition." But the comments weren't sympathetic. They were surgical. "Didn't your mom co-sign your first LLC? Funny how your journey starts right after that land rezoning. It's always the ones born on third who swear they hit a triple." Margaret read them in silence the next day, Susan peering over her shoulder. "She's spiraling," Susan said, almost in disbelief. "It's like watching a chandelier try to argue with gravity." But Margaret only closed the laptop, tucked her legal pad back into her bag, and said nothing. Her silence echoed louder than any post. Susan's voice came through the phone in a tight whisper. "His car's gone. I drove by this morning. Bentley, the one with that ALN Wins plate, not in the driveway." Margaret paused mid-step on the trail behind the community garden, wind teasing at the hem of her coat. "Maybe he's at the gym, or pretending to be someone's hedge fund again." "No, I mean gone, Margaret. No note, no staff, just Victoria, pacing barefoot by the gate, on the phone, and looking like the last guest at a party nobody stayed for." Margaret's fingers tightened around her phone. "Let's wait. People like him never vanish quietly." Susan hesitated, then added, "I saw a tow truck 2 streets over. Looked like it came from her direction." By noon, Margaret was sitting in the corner booth of a quiet cafe, sipping lukewarm tea when a news alert lit up her screen. "Rising Austin mogul Victoria Collins under legal scrutiny amid property trust dispute." The article was polite, for now, just a recap of the filings and court date. But her phone buzzed again 5 minutes later. This time, a voicemail. Victoria. Panicked. Breathless. "Richard, I need you to call me back. It's urgent. Alan's not answering, and the accounts. There's money missing. I need to freeze the transfers. Richard, please. You said I'd be protected. You said—" The message cut off. Margaret leaned back in her seat, letting the phone rest on the table like it weighed 100 pounds. She didn't smile. She didn't smirk. She just stared, stunned at how fast the wind had shifted. At the law offices of Hale and McKinnon, Richard Hale rubbed the bridge of his nose, a deep crease forming between his brows as Victoria's name flashed again on his screen. He didn't pick up. His assistant peeked into his office. "She's called 3 times. Should I?" He shook his head. "No, she's not my client anymore. Tell her I can't speak. Conflict of interest." "But she said it was urgent." Richard looked out the window down toward Congress Avenue, where people hurried about their day, blissfully unaware that fortunes and futures unraveled just a few floors above their heads. "It usually is," he muttered. "Too little, too late." Across town, a cleaning service van idled at the mansion's side entrance. 2 housekeepers emerged, each with a canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Sophie followed them, last to leave. She paused briefly, looking up at the house she'd scrubbed, polished, and kept breathing for months. A cold glass monolith that never once offered warmth. She turned as Victoria appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe and confusion. I'll have the check sent out next week," Victoria called. Sophie didn't answer. She just nodded once and walked down the drive. Margaret didn't mean to drive past the house that day, but her hands took her there anyway. Slow, deliberate turns through the winding Westlake streets until the mansion appeared around the bend, no longer glowing like a prize, but looming like a warning. There were no guests, no laughter. The porch lights were off, but on the gate post, taped hastily beneath the security keypad, was a red and white paper from the county. Notice of delinquency. Margaret parked across the street, engine idling, watching as wind lifted the corner of the notice and flapped it like a white flag. She stayed there until her phone buzzed again. Emily. The little girl's voice was soft, muffled sniffling. "Grandma?" Margaret sat up straighter. "I'm here, sweet pea." "Mommy's really scared," Emily whispered. "She said something's broken, that everything's gone. She keeps locking the doors and crying. I don't know what to do." Margaret swallowed hard. Her voice didn't break. "You don't have to do anything, honey. Just stay safe. I'll talk to Mommy soon, okay?" Emily hesitated. "Okay. Can I come stay with you?" Margaret closed her eyes. A million instincts clawed toward yes, but she forced herself to stay still. "Not yet, baby, but soon." The courtroom was cold in the way only government buildings could be. Sterile, quiet, humming faintly with fluorescent tension. Sunlight streamed through narrow windows high on the walls, catching dust in the air like suspended truth. Margaret stepped into the gallery with calm purpose, her heels echoing softly on the tile. She wore navy slacks, a pressed white blouse, and a gray wool coat. Her folder was tucked tightly beneath one arm, the yellow notepad inside bristling with tabs and handwritten notes. Victoria was already there. She sat at the plaintiff's table, posture stiff, face perfectly powdered. Her lips were glossed and tight, her eyes hidden behind oversized sunglasses she didn't remove, even indoors. She had no lawyer beside her, just a leather tote and a silver phone she refused to put away. When the bailiff called the room to order, Victoria finally looked up and flinched. Margaret didn't return the glance. Judge Rayburn entered moments later. In his 60s, bald with a gravelly voice and famously short on patience, he settled into his chair with the weary grace of someone who had seen far too many people mistake pride for substance. "Case number 2024 CV 887, Collins v. Collins," the clerk read aloud. Margaret stepped forward. "Margaret Collins, appearing pro se." Victoria barely stood. "Victoria Collins. I'm representing myself." The judge sighed, tapping his pen. "I'll remind both parties that this is a civil hearing. Respect and brevity will move things along. Ms. Collins, elder, you may proceed." Margaret took a slow breath, then approached the bench with a steady gait. She handed the clerk her exhibits, neatly bound, the original trust agreement, the misfiled tax documents, the records of dual sale disclosures, the LLCs tied to Allen's name. She turned to the judge. Your Honor, the foundation of Victoria Collins's current wealth originates from property placed in a trust under my name. That trust was never formally dissolved. Its active status grants me legal claim to the assets derived from its holdings, including profits from the development deal that resulted in a $33 million payout. Victoria let out a sharp laugh. Are you serious right now? Judge Rayburn raised a brow. Ms. Collins, you'll have your turn. Margaret continued. In addition, I've provided proof of tax discrepancies and documentation linking her former partner, Alan West, to multiple debts filed under companies in which Victoria was listed as a co-signer. Some of those loans were never repaid. Those liabilities now belong to her. The judge flipped through the binder, expression unreadable. Then Victoria stepped forward. She's just bitter, she snapped. She signed it all over. It was a gift. And now that I've built something of myself, she's trying to claw it back. Do you dispute the documents filed under your name? Rayburn asked. She's my mother, Victoria shouted. She owes me. A hush fell over the room. Even the bailiff looked up. The judge slowly set his pen down. Ms. Collins, I'm going to pretend you didn't just claim maternal obligation as a legal defense for financial misappropriation. Victoria's face flushed red, but she didn't back down. She gave me everything. Isn't that what parents are supposed to do? Margaret didn't look at her. Her eyes were fixed on the judge, her voice calm. I gave her everything, Your Honor, but not to be erased. Rayburn leaned back in his chair, lips pressing into a line. We'll break for 10 minutes. I'll review the exhibits before making preliminary determinations on asset rights. The gavel dropped with a solid crack. Margaret returned to her seat without a word. Behind her, she could hear Victoria breathing hard, the fragile sound of a woman suddenly unsure which direction gravity was pulling. 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. Margaret sat motionless, hands folded on the table, while the quiet murmur of the courtroom rose and fell around her like a tide. Her folder lay closed in front of her. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Now, it was up to the weight of the law, and the eyes of a judge who had seen too many families cannibalize themselves in courtrooms just like this. When Judge Rayburn returned, he didn't look at either woman right away. He adjusted his glasses, opened the binder of exhibits again, and took a long, deliberate sip from a dented courthouse coffee mug. Then he spoke. This court has reviewed the materials presented in Collins v. Collins. While it is not in dispute that the elder Ms. Collins transferred property rights via trust to the younger, it is equally evident that said trust was never legally dissolved, and that the subsequent financial transactions tied to it, namely the development deals, are still, in part, under contested ownership. Victoria shifted in her seat, lips parted slightly. Judge Rayburn continued, voice flat but firm. This court finds sufficient cause to rule that all assets generated directly from the property in question, including capital gains, development income, and leveraged investments, must be frozen pending a formal audit and mediation. Furthermore, debts incurred by third-party entities using Ms. Victoria Collins's name are her sole responsibility, not the petitioner's. The courtroom was silent, dead, aching silent. Rayburn looked up then, his eyes hard. In short, the fortune is built on a house without foundation. It will not stand without scrutiny. And your debts, Ms. Collins, are yours to carry. Victoria's jaw clenched. What does that even mean? It means, he said slowly, that if the audits confirm what's in these documents, a majority of those funds may revert to your mother or her estate, including equity held in current properties, including the home you reside in now. The words hit like a glass cracking from within. No, Victoria breathed. Rayburn set the binder aside. This isn't punishment. This is correction. Victoria shot up from her seat, face flushed and voice sharp enough to crack against the courtroom walls. You can't do this. She's my mother. She's ruining me. Susan, seated 2 rows behind Margaret, tensed. Margaret didn't flinch. Rayburn didn't blink. Your mother didn't ruin you, he said evenly. You made a series of decisions based on presumed impunity. What you built was never fully yours. That matters. Victoria turned to Margaret, eyes wild. You did this to me. Margaret stood slowly, calmly. She took a breath before speaking, and when she did, her voice didn't rise. It fell like a quiet hammer. No, she said. You did this to you. The words hung in the air like smoke. Victoria opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Her phone vibrated loudly in her tote, unanswered. She looked around the room, waiting for someone, anyone, to step in. No one did. Susan approached from the gallery and gently reached for Margaret's hand. Her fingers were warm, firm. She gave a single, grounding squeeze. Rayburn gathered his papers. We'll reconvene in 2 weeks pending audit results. Until then, the financial assets discussed will remain in legal suspension. The gavel came down one final time. Case adjourned. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps, and the world spun on like it hadn't just witnessed the unmaking of a carefully manufactured empire. Margaret walked slowly, Susan at her side. Reporters loitered by the gate, but none approached. It wasn't that they didn't recognize her. It was that she made it very clear she owed no one her voice. Halfway down the steps, Susan broke the silence. You okay? Margaret nodded once. I think so. Susan smirked. You just lit a fuse in there. I didn't light anything, Margaret said. She brought the gasoline. I just stopped apologizing for not being the match. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Margaret drove past the mansion again. The sky was pale with early winter haze, the sun dull behind thin clouds. She didn't slow down at first, just let the road curve naturally toward the hill where the house sat like a monument to arrogance. But as the trees thinned and the gates came into view, her foot eased off the gas. She pulled to the side. The once busy driveway, once choked with luxury cars and caterers' vans, was bare. No tire marks, no activity. The grass had grown in patches, wild and confused, yellowing at the edges. A cracked garden hose snaked across the front walk like a forgotten limb. The place looked abandoned, not just empty, deserted. Margaret rolled down her window. The silence hit first. No laughter, no music. No late-night deliveries. The only sound was the wind brushing against the warped fence panel near the back gate, tapping like a warning. Curtains were pulled across every window, but not neatly, askew, sagging, like someone had ripped them shut in a panic and never bothered to fix them. A pair of garbage bins sat at the curb, overflowing and untouched. And yet, the house still stood, proud, cold, pretending. She felt no triumph in seeing it like this. Only weight. She thought back to the first time she'd seen it, the night of the party. Champagne sparkling through glass and Victoria laughing under a canopy of fireworks. Margaret had believed then, foolishly, that loss might be permanent. Now she saw the truth. Loss could be loud too, and slow, and very public. She almost drove away. But before she could shift into drive, she spotted movement. Emily, small, bundled in a pink coat, came trudging out the front door with her backpack sagging off one shoulder. Her ponytail bounced as she turned toward the gate, pausing at the rusted keypad like she was used to it malfunctioning. Margaret's heart kicked. She stepped out of the car, calling softly, "Em?" Emily turned, and her face lit up. "Grandma!" She ran, arms outstretched, backpack nearly toppling her. Margaret bent to catch her in a tight hug, warmth flooding her chest in an instant. I thought you were picking me up Friday, Emily said. I was just passing by, Margaret replied, brushing hair from the girl's forehead. But I'm glad I saw you. Emily looked back at the house, then down at her sneakers. Mom cries a lot now, at night, when she thinks I'm sleeping. Margaret nodded slowly. I'm sorry to hear that. She said you're mad at her forever. I'm not mad forever, Margaret said carefully. But I'm not pretending nothing happened either. Emily tilted her head. Does that mean she can't come over for dinner? Margaret looked past the child to the mansion, to the shuttered windows and dying roses. She saw the shadow of her daughter behind it all. Somewhere inside, maybe curled up with regret, or still clinging to something hollow and brittle. She needs time, Margaret said softly. Some lessons take pain to learn. Emily looked confused. What kind of lesson? Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she crouched and zipped up the girl's coat. One that might help her find her way back. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind tugging at Emily's scarf. I'll see you Friday, Margaret said finally, pressing a kiss to her forehead. And maybe you and I can make that apple pie you like, Emily beamed. With extra cinnamon. The only way worth making it. Margaret waited until Emily had been picked up by the school shuttle before getting back in her car. She didn't look at the house again. She didn't need to. It was just past 5 in the morning when the pounding started. At first, Margaret thought it was a branch hitting the window. October wind had been brutal all week. But then came the second knock. Harder. More frantic. A hollow thud against wood that wasn't just noise. It was desperation. She sat up in bed, heart ticking in her throat. Susan's voice floated in from the guest room. You hear that? I hear it, Margaret replied, already pulling on her robe. The hallway was dark. Silent, but for the muffled thuds echoing from the front of the house. Margaret padded barefoot to the door, her body still stiff with sleep, stomach coiled tight with something she hadn't felt in years, anticipation laced with dread. She peered through the peephole, and there she was. Victoria. Rain had matted her hair to her scalp, streaking black mascara down her cheeks. She wasn't wearing a coat, only a hoodie 2 sizes too big, the sleeves soaked through. Her hands were trembling, one still raised mid-knock. Her breath came out in clouds, and her lips were parted in disbelief, as if she hadn't expected the door to remain shut this long. Behind Margaret, the kitchen light flicked on. Susan entered with a mug of coffee and narrowed eyes. She said nothing, just leaned against the frame with arms crossed. Watching. Margaret's hand hovered over the deadbolt. Another knock. Please, Mom, Victoria's voice cracked. Please, I have nothing left. Margaret didn't move. I didn't know Alan took everything until it was gone, she choked out, swaying slightly. The accounts are empty. The house is being audited. Emily's sleeping at a neighbor's because the power went out and I couldn't pay the bill. Silence. I was stupid, Victoria whispered. And proud. And so damn sure I could outrun everything. Margaret's eyes didn't leave the door. I told myself you were just bitter, Victoria continued, voice barely audible through the thick wood. But you were right. About Alan. About the money. About me. She sniffed. The cold had turned her voice hollow. I thought I could fix it. I kept thinking. Just one more deal. One more loan. One more distraction. But they're all gone now. Another beat. Then, please, just let me in. Inside, Susan shifted. She expects you to forget everything she did because she finally fell harder than she planned to, she muttered. Convenient timing. Margaret said nothing. She could feel the moment folding in on itself. Standing there, she was suddenly back on her old porch, that afternoon sun scorching the side of her neck, while Alan smirked with her life in his hands. Victoria's voice, sharp and cold. It's not your house anymore. But now, that same daughter stood shaking on her porch, stripped of wealth, of pride, of certainty. She looked like someone who had forgotten how to be anything but untouchable, only to learn too late how fragile that made her. Margaret reached out and clicked the deadbolt. She opened the door, not wide, not welcoming, just enough. An inch. Victoria flinched at the warmth escaping from inside. She met her mother's eyes for the first time in weeks. "I was wrong," she whispered. "About all of it. About you." Margaret didn't speak. Her gaze roamed slowly over the woman she once held in a delivery room, then fed on midnight shifts and tax returns. Behind her, Susan didn't budge. I just need somewhere to start again," Victoria said. Her shoulders slumped forward. "Please, just let me start." Margaret looked at her for a long time, then stepped back. Just once. Enough for the light to catch Victoria's face. Enough for the rain to stop hitting her skin. But the door stayed half shut. That inch was all she gave. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and old wood, the scent baked into the cabinets from years of Sunday pies and sleepless nights. Margaret moved about quietly, pouring water into the kettle and placing it on the stove, her robe tied neatly at the waist. Behind her, Victoria sat hunched at the table, silent, dripping, eyes hollow. She hadn't said much after stepping through the door. Just a thank you. Barely audible, barely there. Susan had handed her a towel and left the room without a word. Now, Victoria sat wrapped in it like a child who had been scolded by the weather itself. Her fingers trembled as she held the chipped ceramic mug of chamomile Margaret had placed in front of her. She didn't drink from it, just held it like a lifeline. "I didn't sleep," she said finally, voice hoarse. Margaret didn't turn. "Neither did I." "I thought I could fix it," Victoria whispered. "I thought, if I could just get one person to invest, or sell something fast enough." "You thought money would forgive you," Margaret said, calm as still water. Victoria flinched but didn't argue. "I lost everything, Mom. The house is next. They froze what little was left, and I haven't even told Emily yet." Margaret turned then, slowly, and leaned against the counter. Her face was unreadable. "You told her plenty already." Victoria's lip trembled. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Margaret walked to the table and sat down across from her, hands folded. "I know you didn't," she said. "That's part of the problem." Victoria opened her mouth to explain. Something about stress, about Alan, about losing control. But the words fell apart in her throat. What excuse could possibly fit inside this house, the one she'd thrown her mother out of only to beg entry weeks later? She bowed her head, ashamed. Footsteps broke the silence, small, quick ones on the hardwood floor. Emily appeared in the doorway, hair tousled, still in her pajama top. "Grandma?" she said, eyes lighting up. Margaret stood just in time to catch her in a hug. Emily clung to her tightly, her voice muffled in the fabric of Margaret's robe. "I missed you. Mommy said we'd see you again, but she didn't know when." Margaret kissed the top of her head. "Well, here I am, sweetheart." Emily pulled back slightly, looking over at her mother, then back at her grandmother. "Can we stay here?" The room tensed. Margaret looked at Victoria, whose eyes pleaded silently over the rim of her tea. Margaret crouched to Emily's level, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You're always welcome, baby, but Mommy and I need to talk grown-up things first. Okay?" Emily nodded solemnly, then padded into the living room where cartoons flickered quietly on the muted television. Margaret stood, her voice lower now. "You're welcome here, but not to rule me again." Victoria blinked hard. "I don't need control," she whispered. "I just need space and time, and maybe one last person who doesn't hate me." Margaret stared at her for a long beat, then nodded. Just once. You'll have what you earn, not what you demand. Victoria lowered her eyes. That's fair. They sat in silence for several minutes, the whistle of the kettle building faintly in the background. Margaret rose to pull it from the burner before it screamed. Behind her, Victoria finally sipped her tea. It had cooled. But it was the first thing she'd tasted in weeks that didn't burn. The sky was still soft with morning when Margaret stepped onto the porch. A blush of orange stretched across the horizon, slipping quietly over the rooftops of East Austin. The air was cool, not biting, just enough to wake her skin. She pulled her sweater tighter around her shoulders and leaned against the worn rail, the one Frank had patched 3 different times over the years. The city stirred slowly, an occasional car passing, a jogger down the block, someone's wind chimes catching the breeze just right. But here, in this little pocket of quiet, Margaret stood still, rooted. Behind her, the house murmured to life. Inside, Victoria slept on the living room couch, curled in a blanket Susan had pulled from the hall closet, one foot sticking out like a child who didn't know whether to flee or stay. Her breath was uneven, jaw clenched even in sleep. That kind of rest didn't restore, it just delayed collapse. But Emily? Emily was laughing. Her voice lifted from the kitchen in clear, joyful bursts, paired with Susan's easy teasing. "More butter, Grandma Sue. That's how you said you like it." "Oh, now I said that? Look who's learning how to shift blame already. Politician in the making." Margaret closed her eyes just for a moment, letting it sink in. Peace. Not relief. Not vengeance. Not the bitter satisfaction of a plan completed. Just peace. Like an ache finally easing from the bones. She'd spent years holding everyone together, working doubles, skipping dinners, trading her own dreams for their security. She gave and gave until she forgot how to keep anything for herself. Now, she was still giving, but differently, on her terms, in her home. She opened her eyes, let them travel across the quiet street, trees just starting to amber, the sun now warming the front walk. "I lost everything once," she whispered to no one. "Not again." She didn't say it with fire. She didn't need to. It wasn't a vow. It was a promise to herself. Behind her, the screen door creaked open. Susan stepped out, coffee in hand, hair up in its usual rushed twist. "She's still out?" "Out cold," Margaret replied, glancing back through the window. "But not for long." Susan leaned beside her on the railing. "How are you?" Margaret thought for a second. "Tired, but good." Susan smiled. "That's a new one." They stood in silence a while longer, the smell of eggs and toast drifting through the air. Emily giggled inside, her voice bright enough to cut through any heaviness left in the walls. Margaret stepped forward and pulled the screen door open, then paused. She looked back once more at the street, the sun now high enough to cast light across the porch steps, catching the dust and the imperfections and everything real. Then she closed the door behind her, firm but gentle. Not to shut anyone out, but to mark what stayed in. Her.